Some of our most fundamental laws began as simple bedtime stories. Cultural myths have silently shaped everything from our justice systems to our holiday traditions for centuries. By the end of this journey, you will understand the true power of the stories we tell and see the hidden architecture of our society. Why did kings once rule by divine right? How did a romanticized view of nature influence colonial laws? The answers reveal how imagination becomes institutionalized power. What story do you think might be guiding our world today without us even realizing it? A king's word was law because it was believed to be God's own will. This idea, known as the divine right of kings, was not just a political tool, it was the very bedrock of society in medieval Europe. Monarchs were not merely powerful men and women, they were seen as God's appointed representatives on earth. To disobey them was to disobey the divine order itself. This belief gave kings and queens absolute authority, a power that philosophers like Jacques-Benin Bossut argued was a reflection of God's own independent and unquestionable nature. This myth was so potent it became embedded in the legal fabric of nations. In England, royal decrees carried the weight of scripture, while in China, a similar concept called the mandate of heaven dictated that emperors ruled with divine approval. The law did not simply protect the throne, it sanctified it, making any challenge an act of heresy punishable by the severest penalties. This created a rigid social hierarchy where your birth into a certain bloodline was seen as a divine appointment, a preordained destiny that no commoner could ever question. It makes you wonder how different our modern democracies might look if this story of God-given power had never been told. This profound link between celestial myth and earthly law leads us to another powerful story, one not about rulers in palaces, but about the very land beneath our feet. While kings claimed power from the heavens, another potent story was taking root, one that redefined humanity itself. European explorers encountering indigenous peoples across new continents did not just see different cultures. They saw a blank canvas for their own philosophical fantasies. They crafted the myth of the noble savage, an idealized image of primitive innocence and natural virtue. This was the belief that humans in a state of nature were inherently good, peaceful, and uncorrupted by the complexities and corruptions of civilization. The philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau gave this idea its most powerful voice, arguing that society itself was the source of our misery and moral decay. But this was not merely a philosophical daydream. It was a story with immense legal consequences. Colonial administrators and lawmakers seized upon this romantic notion to shape their policies. On one hand, the myth justified paternalistic protection laws, framing native peoples as naive children of the forest who needed to be shielded from the harsh realities of the modern world. On the other hand, the very same myth was twisted to justify forced assimilation programs, arguing that these noble but backward people needed to be civilized and saved from their own simplicity. In the United States, this dual approach became embedded in legislation like the Indian Appropriations Acts. These laws sometimes treated tribes as sovereign nations to be protected, and other times as obstacles to progress that needed to be dismantled and absorbed. The myth created a legal paradox where indigenous people were simultaneously idealized and infantilized, their real lives and complex cultures ignored in favor of a European fantasy. The legacy of this story is still with us today. It echoes in modern environmental laws that sometimes romanticize indigenous peoples as innate conservationists, and in ongoing indigenous rights movements that must still navigate these deeply ingrained stereotypes. It demonstrates with startling clarity how a philosophical idea, however well-intentioned, can solidify into concrete legal structures that govern real lives for centuries. This exploration of how we idealized a pure human past makes the next shift in our story all the more striking, as we turn to a myth that organized society not around people, but around property. That romantic ideal of a pure, natural world was soon eclipsed by a far more aggressive national story. A new generation of American pioneers looked westward, convinced their expansion was not just a possibility, but a divine inevitability. They called this idea manifest destiny, a powerful belief that the United States was preordained to spread its influence and institutions across the entire North American continent. This was more than just a political slogan. It was a cultural force that framed conquest as a moral and spiritual duty. The journalist John L. O'Sullivan, who famously coined the term, wrote of a manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence. In his words and in the minds of millions, this was not theft. It was a sacred mission, a fulfillment of a heavenly mandate. This mythology did not stay on the pages of newspapers. It became the engine of American law and policy for decades. The Homestead Act of 1862, for instance, offered vast tracts of western land to settlers for a small fee, legally transforming ancestral native territories into private property for American citizens. This law was built on the assumption that the land was essentially empty and waiting for productive use, a direct consequence of the manifest destiny narrative. Even more devastating was legislation like the Indian Removal Act, which authorized the forced relocation of entire indigenous nations from their homelands to make way for this inexorable expansion. The myth provided the moral cover for immense human suffering, framing displacement as the unfortunate but necessary cost of progress and civilization. The power of this story even reached the highest court in the land, where Supreme Court decisions often interpreted treaties and land rights in ways that favored the expanding nation over the rights of the original inhabitants. How does a nation's identity continue to be forged by such foundational stories? The legacy of manifest destiny reminds us that the maps we draw and the laws we write are often just the physical expressions of the tales we tell ourselves about who we are and what we are meant to become. This belief in a destined hierarchy with one group ordained to lead and expand sets the stage for an even older and more rigid system of social organization, one built not on land but on blood. While kings claimed divine right and nations spoke of manifest destiny, another chilling myth took root, one that sorted people not by their faith or ambition, but by the very blood in their veins. In 15th century Spain, a society gripped by the fervor of the Inquisition gave birth to the doctrine of limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood. This was the belief that a person's true worth and loyalty were determined by their ancestry, an unchangeable biological fact. The myth created a rigid hierarchy where old Christians, those with no Jewish or Muslim forebears, occupied the highest social and legal standing. A conversion to Christianity, no matter how sincere, was considered insufficient. The mythology asserted that the taint of non-Christian ancestry was permanent, an inherent flaw that no amount of religious devotion could ever wash away. This was not just social prejudice, it was codified into law. Statutes based on limpieza de sangre barred anyone with Jewish or Muslim ancestry from universities, from prestigious guilds, and from public offices. To prove your lineage, you had to present detailed genealogical records, your family tree scrutinized for any hint of impurity. These laws transformed a religious difference into a racial one, inventing a biological basis for discrimination that would persist for centuries. The consequences of this myth did not remain confined to Spain. The the concept traveled across the ocean with colonial powers, directly influencing the intricate caste systems established in the Americas. These systems legally classified people by their percentage of European, indigenous, and African blood, creating a detailed pyramid of legal rights and social privileges. The echoes of this blood-based thinking even reached early American immigration policies, where ideas about desirable and undesirable national origins were often framed in terms of preserving a certain racial and cultural stock. It forces us to ask a difficult question. What modern prejudices, those that linger just beneath the surface of our politics and our social debates, might trace their origins back to these ancient mythological concepts of purity? This fixation on bloodlines and inherited status reveals a deep human desire to create order, but it also sets the stage for a very different kind of social myth, one that promised a perfect order based not on ancestry, but on reason itself. But as the old myths of blood and divine right began to fade, a new and revolutionary story took their place, one that reimagined the very source of a government's power. Philosophers like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke proposed a radical idea. They envisioned society not as a preordained hierarchy, but as a voluntary agreement, a deal struck between citizens and their rulers. This was the myth of the social contract, a theoretical pact where people in a hypothetical state of nature willingly surrendered some of their personal freedoms in exchange for the protection and social order that only a government could provide. Hobbes, who witnessed the brutal chaos of the English Civil War, famously argued that without this agreement, human life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. His solution was a powerful sovereign to keep that chaos at bay. John Locke, however, painted a more optimistic picture, arguing that people consented to be governed in order to protect their natural rights to life, liberty, and property. This philosophical story was not just an academic exercise. It became the bedrock of modern constitutional law, directly inspiring the creators of the United States Constitution and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. These documents were not handed down from a king or a god. They were framed as the tangible expressions of this collective agreement, establishing legal frameworks where government power was derived from the consent of the governed. This mythology fundamentally shifted the justification for authority, moving it from divine right to collective consent. It is the story that allows a court to overturn a law or a citizen to challenge a government action because the government is seen as a party to a contract it has broken. Yet this powerful idea also raises profound questions we still grapple with today. How much of our freedom must we give up for our safety? Can you truly consent to a contract you were born into? The social contract is a living myth, constantly being renegotiated in our courtrooms and our legislatures with every debate about privacy, taxation, and the limits of state power. It demonstrates with stunning clarity how an abstract philosophical construct can solidify into the concrete legal principles that define our daily lives. This foundational story of a voluntary societal agreement paved the way for another powerful myth, one that would attempt to organize not our politics but our entire economic world. That profound shift from divine right to a social contract reshaped our political world, but it was a different story altogether that reordered our economic lives. In the bustling workshops and emerging markets of early modern Europe, a new cultural myth began to take hold, one that linked eternal salvation directly to earthly labor. This was the Protestant work ethic, a powerful belief system that transformed hard work and economic success from mere necessities into signs of divine favor. The German sociologist Max Weber famously explored this idea, arguing that Protestant theology, especially the Calvinist belief in predestination, created a deep psychological need for believers to find a tangible sign that they were among God's chosen. Since no one could know for certain if they were saved, financial prosperity and disciplined work became the most visible proof of God's blessing. A successful merchant or a diligent craftsman was not just building a business, they were building evidence of their own salvation. This mythology did not remain in the church pews. It seeped into the very foundations of law and economic policy. Legal frameworks began to fiercely protect private property and the fruits of individual labor, seeing them as almost sacred. Bankruptcy laws became harsher, reflecting the moral failing it was now seen to be. The emerging spirit of capitalism, as Weber called it, was not just about greed. It was a moral and legal system that celebrated relentless work, delayed gratification, and the accumulation of capital as virtues in themselves. This had a devastating flip side. It created a legal and cultural environment that often viewed poverty not as a misfortune, but as a moral failing or a sign of laziness and divine disfavor. Early welfare systems were deliberately minimal and punitive, designed to discourage dependency rather than provide a genuine safety net. The myth justified vast economic inequality by framing the wealthy as righteous and the poor as undeserving. Can you hear the echoes of this story in our modern debates? The arguments that successful people are simply harder working, or that those in poverty need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, are direct descendants of this centuries-old religious narrative. Our entire understanding of what it means to be a productive member of society, and the laws that reward or punish us based on that definition, were profoundly shaped by this fusion of faith and finance. It makes you wonder how our economic systems might look if they had been built on a story that valued communal care as much as individual profit. This deep-seated connection between spiritual belief and economic law reveals just how pervasive mythology's influence can be, an influence that extended powerfully into the most intimate sphere of human life, the roles of men and women. The same economic drive that celebrated a man's work in the public sphere simultaneously wove a powerful myth to anchor women firmly within the home. Step into a middle-class 19th century parlor, and you would find yourself in the heart of a powerful cultural narrative, the cult of domesticity. This was the idealized vision of the true woman, a figure defined by four sacred pillars: piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. She was not just a wife and mother, she was the moral guardian of the family, the angel in the house whose gentle influence was believed to civilize her husband and raise virtuous children. But this comforting story had a sharp legal edge. It became the justification for a web of laws that systematically limited women's rights for generations. The legal doctrine of coverture, for instance, meant that upon marriage, a woman's legal existence was absorbed into her husband's. She could not own property in her own name, sign independent contracts, or keep her own wages. The law saw the husband and wife as one person, and that person was the husband. This mythology of separate spheres, where men operated in the brutal world of commerce and politics and women reigned in the peaceful domestic kingdom, was not just a social suggestion. It was a legal reality. Courts routinely denied women custody of their own children in divorce cases, citing the paramount importance of the father's financial role. Employment opportunities were legally and socially restricted to a few poorly paid feminine professions like teaching or sewing, reinforcing economic dependence. Even the fight for suffrage was a direct battle against this myth, as opponents argued that women's pure and moral nature would be corrupted by the dirty arena of politics. The most insidious part was how this story was internalized. Many women believed it themselves, seeing their confinement as a noble calling, and the myth did not simply vanish with the winning of the vote. Its remnants lingered deep within 20th century law, influencing everything from workplace regulations that restricted women's hours, ostensibly to protect their health for motherhood, to family court biases that automatically favored mothers in custody disputes, reinforcing the idea that child rearing was their primary domain. Look around at our modern world. What contemporary assumptions about a woman's inherent nurturing nature or her primary responsibility for childcare and domestic life might be the quiet, unexamined echoes of this 19th century ideal? This deep-seated mythology governing gender roles was often intertwined with an even more brutal story, one that used the same language of natural order to justify a rigid racial hierarchy. That powerful story of separate spheres for men and women was built on a myth of natural order, a logic that was stretched to its most brutal extreme on a global scale. European ships did not just carry explorers and merchants to new continents. They carried a legal fiction so profound it could erase entire civilizations with a stroke of a pen. They called it Terra Nullius, a Latin term meaning nobody's land. This was the audacious claim that a territory was empty, vacant, and legally unowned, even when it was visibly inhabited by millions of people. How was this possible? The mythology rested on a narrow, self-serving definition of civilization. If indigenous peoples were not farming the land in a European style, with fences, deeds, and permanent settlements, or if they did not have a European-style monarchy and written legal code, then their connection to the land was considered non-existent in the eyes of colonial law. Their ancient spiritual ties, their complex seasonal migrations, their generations of stewardship, all of it was rendered legally invisible. This fiction became the cornerstone of colonial expansion. In Australia, British authorities declared the continent Terra Nullius, despite encountering hundreds of distinct Aboriginal nations. This single claim allowed them to seize the entire landmass without treaty or purchase, dispossessing the original inhabitants by simply pretending they were not there as sovereign peoples. A similar logic was applied across Africa during the scramble for the continent, where European powers drew arbitrary borders on maps, dividing cultures and kingdoms they refused to recognize as legitimate. This mythology was formally codified into international law through concepts like the Discovery Doctrine, a principle articulated by the United States Supreme Court in the early 19th century. This doctrine held that when a European nation discovered lands in the Americas, it automatically gained a preemptive right to extinguish the title of the native inhabitants and claim the land for itself. The presence of millions of people was reduced to a mere technicality. The consequences were catastrophic and enduring. Treaties, when they were signed, were often negotiated under this lopsided legal framework, where indigenous groups were treated not as equal nations but as obstacles to be managed. The landmark Mabo decision in Australia in 1992 finally overturned the legal doctrine of Terra Nullius, recognizing for the first time the concept of native title. But the battle is far from over. Modern disputes over pipeline routes, mining rights, and national park boundaries are all direct continuations of this centuries-old argument. They force us to ask a difficult question. How much of our modern concept of private property, of buying and selling land as a mere commodity, is built upon this original act of mythological erasure? The myth of empty land reveals how a story can be weaponized to not just take territory, but to deny the very humanity of those who live on it, a logic of supremacy that connects perfectly to our next exploration of racial hierarchy. The logic of Terra Nullius provided the legal ground for conquest, but it was a powerful moral story that supplied the righteous fuel. Colonial empires did not just take land, they convinced themselves they were performing a sacred duty, a burden placed upon the shoulders of the white man. Rudyard Kipling's famous poem of the same name captured this ethos perfectly, framing the domination of non-white peoples as a difficult but necessary task for their own good. This was not mere exploitation, it was a civilizing mission, a philanthropic endeavor to lift the savage from his state of ignorance and superstition. The myth transformed colonial administrators into benevolent teachers, and soldiers into reluctant disciplinarians, all serving a higher purpose. This narrative of altruistic responsibility was then meticulously woven into the legal and administrative fabric of entire continents. In British Africa, legislation like the Crown Lands Ordinance declared vast swaths of territory as property of the Crown, not to be stolen, but to be held in trust for natives who were not yet ready to manage it themselves. The law became a tool for paternalistic control, restricting indigenous land rights for their supposed protection. Meanwhile, in French colonies, a policy of assimilation aimed to systematically erase local cultures, languages, and traditions, replacing them with French models. The goal was to create black Frenchmen to civilize by erasure, all under the benevolent guise of offering the gifts of European civilization. Schools became factories for this myth, where children were punished for speaking their mother tongues and taught that their own histories were barbaric and their ancestors primitive. The legal system was refashioned to favor European customs, while traditional justice and governance were dismissed as illegitimate. Can you see the ghost of this story in our modern world? It whispers in certain international development projects that arrive with pre-packaged solutions, dismissing local knowledge as backward. It echoes in the rhetoric used to justify military interventions in the name of spreading democracy, a modern civilizing mission that often ignores the complex realities on the ground. The central question remains as potent today as it was a century ago. Who gets to decide what progress looks like and whose standards should define a civilized society? This colonial mindset, built on a myth of cultural superiority, was not just an export, it became a core component of the stories nations told about themselves, stories of unity and purity that often concealed a far more complex and divided reality. The same colonial logic that spoke of a civilizing mission abroad found a different, more optimistic voice at home in America. Across the ocean, a new nation was crafting its own foundational story, one of inclusion through transformation. They called it the melting pot, a powerful metaphor envisioning a cauldron where diverse immigrant cultures would shed their old identities and emerge as a new, unified American. This was not a story of subjugation, but of voluntary and hopeful assimilation, a promise that anyone could become part of the national family if they were willing to blend in. This mythology directly fueled the great waves of immigration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, offering a powerful, inclusive alternative to the rigid ethnic hierarchies of the Old World. Yet this welcoming ideal had a legal undercurrent with immense force. The very first federal naturalization law in 1790 restricted citizenship to any alien, being a free white person, setting an initial racial boundary for who was allowed to melt in the first place. Later, as millions arrived from Southern and Eastern Europe, the myth drove policies designed to hasten the blending process. Public schools became the primary engines of this assimilation, with laws in numerous states mandating English-only instruction. These laws were not gentle suggestions, they were legal mandates that often punished children for speaking their native tongues in the schoolyard, actively pressuring families to abandon their linguistic heritage. The curriculum itself was a tool of the myth, teaching a sanitized version of American history that emphasized unity and downplayed ethnic divisions, all to create that single, homogeneous national identity. This pressure extended beyond the classroom. Cultural traditions, from distinctive foods to holiday celebrations, were often dismissed as un-American, something to be left behind in the old country. The mythology created a painful double bind for immigrants. They were welcomed for their labor and their potential to become American, yet were simultaneously scorned for the very cultural traits that made them who they were. How does a concept both include and exclude simultaneously? The melting pot did it by making inclusion conditional on erasure. This legacy is fiercely debated today. The ideal of a shared national culture persists, but it now competes with the philosophy of multiculturalism, which argues for a mosaic of distinct cultures coexisting rather than a single blended pot. Modern arguments over bilingual education, official English laws, and the very definition of American values are all direct continuations of this century-old conversation. It forces us to ask what we truly mean by integration. Is it about becoming the same, or about finding a way to belong while remaining different? This national story of blending and conformity sets the stage for another powerful set of myths, ones that would attempt to classify not cultures, but the very minds of individuals, defining who was a productive citizen and who was a criminal threat. That hopeful story of a melting pot carried a hidden, more sinister question. If society could be perfected by blending the right people together, what should be done with those deemed fundamentally flawed? In the late 19th century, a new and chilling myth offered a scientific-sounding answer. The Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso stepped forward with a theory that would captivate the Western world, the idea of the born criminal. Lombroso claimed that criminals were not made by their environment or choices, but were biological throwbacks to a primitive stage of human evolution. He argued you could literally see their criminal nature etched into their bodies, identifying them by physical stigmata like a sloping forehead, a prominent jaw, unusually large or small ears, or even excessive tattoos. This was not just an observation, it was a full-blown mythology that redefined crime as an innate, hereditary disease. The legal system eagerly absorbed this pseudoscience. Police departments began using mugshots and anthropometric measurements, cataloging the physical features of arrested individuals in an attempt to build a visual database of criminality. These practices laid the groundwork for modern racial and ethnic profiling, where certain physical characteristics became unfairly associated with a predisposition to break the law. In courtrooms, a defendant's appearance could subtly influence a jury's perception of their guilt, and early parole boards sometimes considered these supposed atavistic traits when deciding if an inmate was reformed or simply born bad. The most devastating impact of this myth, however, was its role in fueling the eugenics movement. If criminality was inherited like a physical trait, the logic followed that society could be improved by preventing criminals from having children. Laws authorizing the forced sterilization of inmates in prisons and institutions for the mentally ill were passed across the United States and Europe, all justified by this pseudoscientific narrative of biological destiny. The echoes of this debunked theory are still with us, though they have changed their clothes. How often do we hear discussions about crime that focus on the neighborhood someone comes from or their family background, implicitly suggesting a cycle that is inevitable rather than a product of systemic failure? The myth of the born criminal tempts us to see lawbreaking as a personal, biological failing, letting us off the hook for examining the social and economic conditions that truly foster it. This dangerous leap from classifying bodies to judging minds leads us directly to our next exploration, a set of myths that claim to measure human worth and potential with a single, definitive number. The belief that a person's character was written in the shape of their skull offered a chillingly simple solution for ranking human worth. In the parlors and lecture halls of the 19th century, phrenologists claimed they could measure intelligence, morality, and even criminal tendencies by meticulously mapping the bumps and contours of the human head. They believed the brain was an organ of the mind, divided into distinct regions, each governing a different faculty like benevolence, destructiveness, or acquisitiveness. A prominent bump in a particular area was thought to indicate an overdeveloped trait, while a depression suggested a deficiency. This was not fringe entertainment. It was a widely accepted pseudoscience that created a seemingly objective hierarchy of human capability. The implications were immediate and devastating for educational policy. School systems, eager for a scientific method to sort students, sometimes used phrenological assessments to determine a child's potential. A child from a poor immigrant family whose skull was measured and deemed inferior could be legally diverted away from academic tracks and into manual training programs, their future opportunities legally limited by the shape of their own head. This mythology provided the perfect, respectable cover for pre-existing prejudices. It transformed social and racial discrimination into a matter of scientific fact. Immigration law was another fertile ground for this false science. In the United States, as nativist sentiment grew against newcomers from Southern and Eastern Europe, phrenologists were sometimes called upon to provide evidence that these groups had cranial features indicating lower intelligence or a propensity for violence. These claims were used to argue for restrictive quotas, creating a legal immigration system that favored certain physical, and by extension racial, characteristics over others. The echoes of this pseudoscience are not just a relic of the past. They whisper in our modern fascination with standardized intelligence testing, where a single number can be used to label a person's potential, often with profound consequences for their educational and professional paths. They linger in the dangerous allure of algorithms that claim to predict criminal behavior based on data points that can mirror the old phrenological profiles. It forces us to ask a difficult question. What seemingly objective measurements do we use today to sort people, to grant opportunity or deny it, that future generations will look back on as nothing more than sophisticated mythology? The story of phrenology is a stark warning of how easily we can dress up our biases in the language of science and then write them into law. This desire to quantify human potential did not stop at the classroom or the border. It marched directly into the marketplace, transforming the very way we think about work and value. While phrenologists were busy measuring heads, another powerful mythology was taking root in the national consciousness, one that measured a man by his wealth. The self-made man became the defining American hero, a figure born in the log cabin who clawed his way to a mansion through nothing but grit and determination. This story insisted that the frontier, and later the industrial economy, was a pure meritocracy where individual willpower was the sole engine of success. It was a narrative that conveniently ignored the immense systemic advantages at play, from government land grants and railroad subsidies to the availability of cheap immigrant labor and the displacement of native peoples. This cultural belief did not just inspire novels and speeches, it became the bedrock of American economic law. Legislators shaped policies that championed the individual above all else. Property rights were fiercely protected, ensuring a man could keep every dollar he earned without obligation to the community that enabled his success. Bankruptcy laws were often punitive, framing financial failure as a deep personal and moral flaw, rather than a consequence of market forces or simple misfortune. Taxation policies were designed to be minimal, reflecting the idea that the wealthiest citizens had earned their fortunes independently and should not be forced to support those who had not worked as hard. The industrial titans of the Gilded Age became the living embodiments of this myth. Figures like Andrew Carnegie preached a gospel of wealth, arguing that the accumulation of massive fortunes was not just a personal achievement, but a sign of superior character and virtue. In their telling, the millionaire was a natural product of evolution, a testament to the power of the self-made ideal. This mythology provided the moral justification for vast inequality, framing poverty as evidence of laziness or incompetence. Can you hear the echoes of this story in our modern political debates? The arguments against robust social welfare programs, the belief that anyone can succeed if they just try hard enough, the relentless celebration of billionaire entrepreneurs as heroes, these are all direct descendants of the self-made man narrative. It asks a profound question of us today. How might our economic policies look different if they were built on a story that acknowledged our interdependence, that recognized how public roads, educated workforces, and legal systems create the very platform upon which individual success is built? The self-made man is a potent reminder that our laws often reflect not economic reality, but the stories we most want to believe about ourselves. That mythology of the self-made man, of a nation built by individual grit, coalesced into a far grander story on the world stage. A nation came to believe it was not just successful, but singularly chosen, a city upon a hill destined to lead and transform the entire globe. This is the potent myth of American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States possesses a unique character and a special historical mission that sets it apart from all other nations. It is a story that began with the Puritan settlers who saw their new community as a divine experiment, a beacon of righteousness for a watching world. This conviction did not fade with the colonies. It evolved, transforming from a religious vision into a political and cultural certainty that would dictate America's role in the world for centuries. This sense of unique destiny became the legal and moral justification for actions that other nations would deem imperialistic. The entire doctrine of manifest destiny was simply the domestic application of this exceptionalist faith, the belief that American expansion was not just inevitable but morally right. This same logic was projected outward in the Spanish-American War, where the United States framed its acquisition of territories like Puerto Rico and the Philippines not as a colonial land grab, but as a benevolent mission to guide and civilize. This mythology was codified into policy through doctrines like the Monroe Doctrine, which unilaterally declared the Western Hemisphere an American sphere of influence, and later in the Truman Doctrine, which committed the nation to a global struggle against communism, casting itself as the world's indispensable defender of freedom. This self-perception creates what scholars call the American civil religion, a set of patriotic rituals and beliefs, from the Pledge of Allegiance to the reverence of the Constitution, that sanctifies the nation's purpose. The myth continues to exert immense force in modern debates. It echoes in arguments for military intervention, framed not as strategic choices but as moral obligations to spread democracy. It resonates in immigration policy, where the idea of America as a special haven can simultaneously inspire open arms and justify fierce border control to protect that unique promise. It even shapes domestic laws on everything from environmental regulation to healthcare, where the belief in a uniquely American way of life can resist policies that are commonplace in other developed nations. How does this deeply ingrained story of being the exception influence how America responds to global challenges like climate change or international treaties? The belief in a special destiny can be a source of immense national confidence, but it can also blind a nation to its own flaws and to the valuable perspectives of others. This exploration of how a nation's story about itself shapes its global role makes the next logical step clear as we turn to the myths that promised not just national perfection, but the perfection of humanity itself. That powerful belief in a nation's unique destiny often rests upon a much broader, almost geological assumption about history itself. We have all seen the famous image, a single line of figures marching from a crouched ape to an upright modern human. This is the march of progress, a visual myth that has convinced us human history is an unstoppable escalator ride from primitive to advanced, from simple to complex. This framework suggests that all societies are on the same track, moving toward the same destination, with Western industrial society naturally leading the way at the pinnacle. It is a story of inevitable improvement, a comforting tale that our best days are always ahead of us. But this linear narrative is a powerful fiction, one that has been used to justify immense legal and social interventions. Colonial administrators saw themselves not as conquerors, but as progress agents, pushing backward societies forward along the predetermined track. Their laws were designed to dismantle traditional land use, governance, and cultural practices, replacing them with European models deemed more evolved. In the 20th century, this same mythology fueled international development programs that prescribed a single, universal path to modernization. Agencies like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund often attached strict conditions to their loans, demanding that nations privatize industries, deregulate markets, and focus on export crops. These policies were legal contracts based on the progressive myth, and they frequently prioritized economic metrics over cultural survival, sometimes forcing nomadic peoples to settle or transforming diverse farmlands into monoculture plantations. Even today, we measure a nation's success by its gross domestic product, a single number that ignores community cohesion, environmental health, and spiritual well-being. We label societies as developed or developing, placing them on an imaginary ladder where one rung is inherently better than the last, but history is not a straight line. Civilizations collapse, technologies are lost, and well-being does not always increase with complexity. The Roman aqueducts were feats of engineering that Europe would not match for 1,000 years. The intricate social welfare systems of many indigenous cultures provided security without the need for vast bureaucratic states. What if we visualized social change not as a march, but as a tree with countless branching paths, or as a spiral where societies revisit old solutions in new contexts? The myth of progress locks us into a single story, blinding us to the wisdom of other ways of living and the real costs of our chosen path. It forces a difficult question. What priceless aspects of human experience have we sacrificed at the altar of this relentless forward motion? This exploration of how we narrate our collective past leads us directly to the deepest myths of all, the ones we tell about the fixed and unchanging nature of humanity itself. Thomas Hobbes gave us a story that would shape prisons and parliaments for centuries. He envisioned humanity's original state not as a peaceful garden, but as a terrifying war of all against all, where life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This bleak portrait of the state of nature was not just a philosophical thought experiment. It became a foundational myth, a powerful argument that human beings are fundamentally dangerous to one another, and that our violent instincts require a powerful authority to keep them in check. This story provided the intellectual bedrock for legal systems built overwhelmingly on control and punishment. Criminal codes focused on deterrence through harsh penalties, operating on the assumption that without the fear of severe consequences, people would naturally descend into chaos. On the global stage, this same logic fueled theories of international relations where nations, existing in a lawless state of nature with no world government above them, were expected to act in their own ruthless self-interest, leading to endless cycles of suspicion and arms races. The mythology justified the creation of powerful sovereign states with extensive police powers and vast surveillance apparatuses. Why invest in social programs when the root problem is an unchangeable human nature that must simply be dominated? This perspective continues to echo in our modern debates. It is present in arguments for preemptive policing in certain neighborhoods, in the justification for expansive government data collection in the name of security, and in the perpetual tension between civil liberties and public safety. Our entire legal framework is, in many ways, a grand reaction to Hobbes's dark prophecy. But what if he was wrong? What if our legal systems were built on a more optimistic story about human capacity for cooperation and empathy? How would our prisons, our foreign policies, and our very concept of justice change if we believed trust was just as natural as suspicion? This grim view of humanity as inherently chaotic set the stage for an economic theory that would embrace that chaos as a natural and even beneficial force. That grim vision of an unruly humanity found its economic counterpart in a story of spontaneous order. A Scottish philosopher named Adam Smith described a market economy as guided by what he called an invisible hand. This powerful metaphor suggested that when each person acts in their own self-interest, buying and selling for personal gain, they are led as if by an unseen force to promote the good of society as a whole. The butcher sells you meat not out of charity, but to make a living, and yet you both benefit from the exchange. This was the myth that transformed greed from a sin into a public service, arguing that the relentless pursuit of profit would naturally result in the most efficient and prosperous outcome for everyone. The idea did not remain a theory in a book. It became a legal mandate, shaping the very architecture of modern commerce. For more than a century, this belief fueled a relentless push for deregulation, for laws that untied the hands of business and industry. Antitrust legislation designed to break up monopolies was itself a reaction to the failures of this invisible hand, an admission that the market did not always self-correct. Yet the core mythology persisted, arguing that government intervention, even with good intentions, would only disrupt this natural and benevolent mechanism. This story became the foundation for international trade agreements like NAFTA, which were built on the premise that lowering tariffs and removing trade barriers would allow the invisible hand to work its magic across borders, creating wealth for all participating nations. But what happens when the hand remains invisible because it simply is not there? The myth struggles to account for the pollution dumped into a river because it is cheaper than proper disposal, or for the factory that moves overseas for cheaper labor, leaving a community in ruins. It offers little comfort to the worker whose skills are rendered obsolete by technological change, told that the market has simply spoken. Our modern debates are still saturated with this story. Arguments for cutting taxes for the wealthy often hinge on the idea that they will reinvest that money, the benefits trickling down to everyone else as the invisible hand distributes its rewards. The tension between deregulating an industry and protecting consumers from its excesses is a direct conflict between faith in this self-regulating system and the reality of its limitations. What if our economic laws were based on a different narrative, one that saw the economy not as a natural force but as a garden that requires constant, careful tending? The story of the invisible hand demonstrates how a simple metaphor can harden into economic dogma, a cultural belief that continues to shape our livelihoods and our laws. That invisible hand promised a spontaneous economic order, but for most of human history, the universe was imagined as a structure of perfect, unchanging hierarchy. Medieval scholars envisioned the cosmos as a magnificent ladder, a great chain of being that stretched from God at the pinnacle down through angels, kings, nobles, commoners, animals, plants, and finally to mere stones. Every person, every creature, every object had its preordained, fixed place in this divine order. This was not just a spiritual idea, it was a comprehensive legal and social blueprint. The law became the tool that enforced this cosmic ranking here on Earth. Legal codes formalized the vast gulf between nobility and commoners, with sumptuary laws dictating what clothes you could wear, what food you could eat, and even what colors you were permitted to display, all based on your inherited rank. The entire feudal system was a legal manifestation of this chain, binding serfs to the land they worked and obligating them to a local lord, who in turn owed allegiance to a king who answered only to God. This mythology even dictated humanity's relationship with the natural world. Concepts like dominion over nature, which gave humans a divine license to use the earth and its creatures as they saw fit, were rooted in this belief that we occupied a higher, separate rung on the universal ladder. Environmental regulations, where they existed, were not about protecting nature for its own sake, but about managing a resource that belonged by right to those at the top of the human hierarchy. The chain provided a ready-made justification for denying rights to women, to the poor, and to indigenous peoples, all of whom were seen as occupying a naturally lower station. While we no longer officially believe in this cosmic ladder, its shadow lingers in our institutions. We still instinctively create social and professional hierarchies. We still often value a towering oak tree more than the fungus that decomposes it, or a charismatic whale more than a vital insect. Our legal systems still struggle to grant true standing to non-human entities like rivers or ecosystems, because our foundational story tells us the world is a hierarchy to be managed, not a web of which we are a part. What if we replaced the image of a chain with the image of a web? How would our environmental laws change if we saw ourselves as one interdependent node in a complex network, rather than the rightful masters at the top of a pyramid? This ancient cosmic story prepared the ground for a very modern and equally potent set of myths that claim to organize our world not by divine order, but by rational scientific principles. The great chain of being fixed each person's place by divine decree, but a new philosophy promised to shatter those chains entirely. 17th century thinkers like John Locke proposed a radical alternative, the idea that every human mind begins as a blank slate, a tabula rasa devoid of any innate ideas or predispositions. According to this powerful myth, we are not born with a pre-written destiny, but are shaped entirely by our experiences, our education, and our environment. This was a story of breathtaking optimism, suggesting that human potential was infinitely malleable and that society could be perfected by perfecting the conditions in which people were raised. This belief did not remain confined to philosophical texts. It became the engine for monumental social and legal reforms. The entire concept of universal public education was built upon this foundation. If every child's mind was a blank slate, then the state had a moral obligation to inscribe upon it, to provide schooling that would create literate, moral, and productive citizens. Compulsory education laws swept across nations, legally mandating that children be removed from their homes and placed in classrooms where the right lessons could be written on their pristine minds. The myth also revolutionized the concept of justice, particularly for the young. The modern juvenile court system was founded on the belief that a child who broke the law was not inherently evil, but was a product of a bad environment. The legal response, therefore, was not simply to punish, but to rehabilitate, to erase the negative influences and rewrite the child's future through reform schools and guidance. This same logic underpinned ambitious social welfare programs aimed at lifting people out of poverty, operating on the faith that with the right support and education, anyone could be remade into a self-sufficient member of society. But this empowering story had a dark side. It sometimes led to aggressive social engineering projects that dismissed cultural traditions and individual differences as mere errors to be corrected. It could lead to a kind of benevolent tyranny where experts and officials felt entitled to redesign lives from the top down, convinced they were writing on a blank page. And the myth often struggled when it confronted the stubborn realities of human biology and psychology, the growing evidence that we are not born perfectly blank, but come into the world with a complex mix of inherited traits and predispositions. Can you see the legacy of this battle in our world today? The intense debates over educational methods, the arguments about whether crime is a product of poverty or personal choice, the very nature versus nurture divide that runs through so many of our social policies, all of them are echoes of this centuries-old belief in the blank slate. It forces us to ask a profound question. What if we built our laws on a more nuanced story, one that acknowledges our incredible capacity for change while also respecting the unique, complex individuals we are from the very start? This philosophical struggle to define human nature is now being overtaken by a new and even more powerful set of myths, ones that promise to redefine humanity not through philosophy but through technology. Our legal systems often race to keep up with a force they treat as inevitable. We have come to believe that technology follows its own unstoppable path, a mythology known as technological determinism. This is the idea that tools like the printing press, the steam engine, or the smartphone emerge according to an internal logic of progress, and that our societies, our laws, and even our very behaviors are then forced to adapt in predictable ways. We speak of the internet revolutionizing communication or artificial intelligence disrupting entire job markets as if these outcomes were preordained, not the result of countless human choices and power structures. This story transforms innovation from a social process into a natural force, like a river carving its own canyon, and our legal frameworks have been built along its banks. Patent law, for instance, often operates on this assumption, aggressively protecting intellectual property to fuel an innovation engine that must not be slowed. The result is a system that can prioritize the rights of inventors over broader public access, sometimes creating monopolies on life-saving medicines or locking away knowledge behind impenetrable paywalls. In the realm of internet governance, we see this myth in the early, laissez-faire approach to digital platforms, where a belief in the inherent democratizing power of the web led to minimal regulation, allowing issues like data harvesting and the spread of misinformation to flourish. Our privacy laws now scramble to catch up, often treating corporate surveillance as an unavoidable cost of modern life rather than a design choice we could legally challenge. This deterministic view is currently shaping our approach to artificial intelligence and genetic engineering. We hear arguments that we must push forward with AI development at all costs because other nations will, or that gene editing is an inevitable frontier we are compelled to cross. The law in this story becomes a reactive tool for managing the fallout, not a proactive one for steering the direction of progress. But what if we told a different story? What if we saw technology not as a driver but as a passenger, its destination determined by our collective values and the rules we choose to write? A legal system built on that alternative narrative would ask different questions. It would not just ask if a technology can be built, but whether it should be built and for whose benefit. It would prioritize public deliberation and ethical guardrails, treating innovation as a servant to human flourishing, not its master. This rethinking of our relationship with the machines we build leads us directly to the myths we tell about the natural world we inhabit, stories that have given us the power to protect our planet or to plunder it. The story of a frontier with endless bounty was written directly into the legal deeds of a continent. For generations, the myth of limitless resources convinced expanding societies that the land and its riches existed solely for human taking. This was the frontier mentality, a powerful cultural engine that saw nature not as a fragile system to be nurtured, but as an inexhaustible storehouse to be emptied. The law became the primary tool for this extraction, transforming a mythology of abundance into a concrete reality of ownership and use. Property laws were designed not to protect the land, but to transfer it quickly from the public domain into private hands, with statutes like the Homestead Act requiring only minimal proof of improvement, like building a cabin or plowing a field, to grant full title. This legal framework treated the environment as a collection of separate commodities to be claimed. Water rights, especially in the American West, were governed by the doctrine of prior appropriation, which essentially rewarded the first person to divert a stream for mining or agriculture with a permanent, senior right to that water. This use it or lose it system legally discouraged conservation, as saving water for a dry year could mean forfeiting your legal claim to it forever. Mineral rights were similarly severed from surface land ownership, encouraging a rush to drill and mine with little regard for the landscape above. The consequences of this legalized myth are etched into our world. Deforested mountains, depleted aquifers, and Superfund sites are the legacy of a legal system that for centuries prioritized quick development over long-term stewardship. This mythology is far from dead. It whispers in contemporary debates where drilling in protected wilderness is framed as an economic necessity, or where urban sprawl continues to pave over farmland and wildlife corridors in the name of growth. How might our relationship with natural resources look if our laws had been built on a story of cyclical renewal instead of infinite extraction? What if water law was based on the concept of a watershed's health, or property law required proof of ecological stewardship? The frontier myth sold us a story of endless new horizons, but it left us with the difficult reality of a single, finite planet. This relentless drive to conquer new territory outside of ourselves finds a strange parallel in a very different kind of myth, one that promised we could also conquer the wild frontiers within our own mind. That persistent myth of a limitless frontier outside ourselves found its perfect parallel in a longing for a lost world within. Cultures across the globe have told themselves a story of a golden age, a time in the distant past when the world was perfect, society was harmonious, and humanity lived in a state of effortless grace. The ancient Greeks and Romans spoke of the reign of Saturn, an era of peace and abundance without labor or conflict. The Abrahamic faiths described the Garden of Eden, a paradise of innocence before the fall. This was not mere storytelling, it was a potent form of nostalgia for a perfection that never truly existed, a past that current times could only hope to imitate. This mythology of a lost golden age did not remain in the realm of poetry. It became a powerful legal and political force, driving lawmakers to craft statutes aimed at restoring a past glory that was pure imagination. For centuries, sumptuary laws were a direct expression of this desire. These regulations dictated what colors, fabrics, and styles of clothing different social classes were permitted to wear. The goal was to enforce a rigid social hierarchy that mirrored an idealized and entirely fictional vision of a perfectly ordered medieval society. By legally preventing a wealthy merchant's wife from wearing the same silk as a duchess, the law was trying to force society back into a nostalgic fantasy of clear, unchanging ranks. We see this same pattern in moral legislation designed to enforce traditional values, from laws restricting certain forms of entertainment to statutes governing family life and personal conduct. The underlying logic is always the same. If we can just legislate a return to the customs of a purer, simpler time, we can recapture that lost golden age. The legal attempts to recapture this mythological past almost always involve restricting social change and enforcing conformity to imagined historical norms. Can you feel the powerful pull of this story in our world today? It echoes in political movements that promise to make a country great again, a slogan that implicitly points to a faded, idealized past waiting to be restored. It resonates in debates over education, where curriculum battles are often fought over which version of history, which golden age children should be taught to venerate. It even shapes environmental policy, where some advocate for a return to pre-industrial agricultural methods as a pure and natural ideal. This golden age mythology reveals a profound truth about how we govern ourselves. Our laws are not just plans for the future, they are often love letters to a past we have invented. This powerful longing for a perfect, ordered past prepares us to understand the most foundational myth of modern society, the story of a voluntary agreement that created government itself. Charles Darwin's theories of natural selection were still fresh when a new and dangerous story began to twist them into a social blueprint. Thinkers like Herbert Spencer took the biological concept of survival of the fittest and applied it directly to human societies, creating the potent myth of social Darwinism. This was the belief that social progress was driven by relentless competition, where the strong and wealthy naturally rose to the top, while the poor and weak were destined to fail. In this harsh narrative, poverty was not a social problem to be solved, but a natural and necessary outcome, a form of societal weeding out that improved the overall health of the human race. This mythology did not remain an abstract philosophy. It became a legal and political battering ram used to dismantle social supports and justify extreme inequality. In the economic sphere, it fueled the rise of laissez-faire policies, where any government regulation of business was seen as an unnatural interference in this vital competition. Monopolies were allowed to form and crush smaller competitors, all under the guise of letting the fittest companies naturally succeed. This same logic was weaponized against early attempts at social welfare. Proposals for public health initiatives or poverty relief were fiercely opposed by those who argued that helping the poor would only perpetuate weakness and degrade the national stock. The most horrific application of this myth was its role in the eugenics movement. If society was an evolutionary struggle, the reasoning went, then the state had a duty to actively guide it by preventing the so-called unfit from reproducing. This led to laws across the United States and Europe authorizing the forced sterilization of tens of thousands of people deemed genetically inferior, often those who were poor, disabled, or from marginalized communities. The echoes of this competitive framework are still loud in our modern political debates. How often do we hear arguments against universal health care or robust unemployment, benefits that frame such support as a crutch that discourages personal responsibility and disrupts the natural economic order? The language may have changed, but the underlying story remains the same, that society thrives on competition and suffers from compassion. What if we replaced this story with one that sees human thriving as collaborative, where our laws are designed to lift everyone up rather than sort them into winners and losers? The myth of social Darwinism reveals how easily a scientific insight can be warped into a cruel cultural narrative, one that then hardens into law. This brutal vision of society as a competitive arena finds its counterpoint in the myths we tell about the one institution meant to uplift everyone, the classroom. That assembly line model of education treats young minds like containers on a conveyor belt, waiting to be filled with standardized information. The classroom becomes a factory for knowledge transmission, where the teacher's role is to pour facts into passive, receptive students. This is the myth of the empty vessel, a powerful cultural belief that learning is simply the transfer of a fixed body of knowledge from one generation to the next. It suggests that a child's mind is essentially a blank slate, and education is the process of writing the correct information upon it. This idea did not stay in the philosopher's study. It became the blueprint for modern public schooling, directly shaping the legal and administrative machinery that governs our classrooms. Educational funding formulas often reward schools for high scores on standardized tests that measure the recall of specific facts, not the ability to think critically or solve novel problems. Teacher certification requirements frequently emphasize content knowledge over training in fostering curiosity or facilitating discussion. The entire structure, from the rigid 50-minute class periods to the age-based grade levels, is designed for efficient delivery, not for the messy, unpredictable, and deeply personal journey of genuine understanding. The legacy of this myth is a system where success is often defined by the ability to absorb and repeat information, rather than to question, create, or connect ideas. Can you feel the weight of this in our modern debates over curriculum? The battles over which historical narratives get included in textbooks, or the intense focus on teaching to the test, are all symptoms of this underlying belief that education is about transmitting a single, correct version of the world. What if our laws were built on a different story about learning? Imagine an educational system founded on the philosophy of constructionism, where students are seen as active builders of their own knowledge, or on the Socratic method, where the goal is not to provide answers but to cultivate the skill of asking better questions. In such a system, funding might be tied to project-based learning outcomes. Teacher training would prioritize mentorship and facilitation, and assessments would evaluate a student's ability to research, collaborate, and think critically. The empty vessel myth has given us a system that often confuses memorization with intelligence. It asks us to consider what true potential is lost when we design our schools for filling minds instead of igniting them. This deep-seated belief about how we learn prepares the ground for the final cultural myths we will explore, the powerful stories that attempt to explain the entire trajectory of human civilization itself. That straight line from primitive to civilized was once considered an unshakable fact of human history. 19th-century anthropologists like Lewis Henry Morgan drew tidy charts dividing all societies into rigid stages, from savagery to barbarism, and finally to civilization. This was the myth of unilinear cultural evolution, a powerful story insisting that every human group, no matter where it began, was destined to march through the exact same sequence of development. Western industrial nations, of course, always sat at the very top of this imagined ladder, representing the pinnacle of human achievement. This was not just an academic theory. It became a legal and administrative blueprint for colonial powers. Administrators used this framework to justify their rule, arguing that native peoples were simply at an earlier, more childlike stage of development and required European guidance to advance. The law became the primary tool for this forced evolution. Colonial legal codes systematically dismantled traditional land tenure systems, replacing complex communal ownership with European-style private property laws, because private property was seen as a hallmark of a more civilized society. They outlawed indigenous spiritual practices and governance structures, not merely to suppress them, but to actively push societies toward the next prescribed stage on the evolutionary chart. The devastating impact of this myth did not end with colonialism. In the 20th century, its logic was repackaged into modern international development policy. Institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund often prescribed a single, universal path to modernization. Their loan agreements, which are legally binding contracts, demanded that nations privatize state industries, deregulate markets, and focus on export-led growth. These policies were not neutral economic advice. They were based on the unshakable belief that all nations must follow the Western model to succeed, prioritizing industrial agriculture over traditional farming and urban formal economies over informal community-based systems. Even today, we measure a nation's progress through a narrow set of metrics like gross domestic product, a number that ignores cultural vitality, environmental health, and communal well-being. We still label countries as developed or developing, placing them on that same imaginary ladder. But history refuses to follow a straight line. Some of the most sustainable and socially cohesive societies in human history existed long before the Industrial Revolution, and some modern technological advances come with profound social costs that the simple progress narrative ignores. What if we measured development not by the size of a nation's economy, but by the health and happiness of its people? How would our foreign aid policies change if we respected multiple paths to a good life, instead of insisting on one single road to a destination we ourselves have not yet reached? This rigid story of a single cultural path connects to a different, yet equally powerful, set of stories that attempt to explain the very source of human diversity. Scientists once tried to organize humanity like a library, sorting people by skin color and skull shape into supposedly distinct biological races. They measured jawlines and cranial capacities, searching for physical proof to support a modern mythology of inherent difference. This was not ancient superstition, but a pseudoscientific effort to create a new hierarchy for the modern world. The myth insisted that these racial categories were fixed biological realities, carrying with them innate traits of intelligence, temperament, and moral character. This powerful fiction did not stay in the lecture hall. It was written directly into the legal code, shaping the lives of millions. In the American colonies, slave codes legally defined Africans and their descendants as property, a status justified by the myth of their biological inferiority and natural suitability for servitude. These laws hardened a system of brutal exploitation by framing it as a natural order. Later, Jim Crow segregation statutes legally enforced separation in every aspect of public life, from schools and buses to drinking fountains and cemeteries, all built on the foundational myth that the races were biologically distinct and must be kept apart. The legal machinery extended to the most intimate sphere through anti-miscegenation laws, which criminalized marriage and relationships across racial lines. The United States Supreme Court did not strike down these laws nationwide until 1967, in the landmark Loving versus Virginia case. For centuries, the law had treated these invented categories as real, using them to dictate where you could live, whom you could love, and what rights you could claim. The echoes of this biological myth are still with us, though the language has shifted. They resonate in contemporary debates over affirmative action and diversity initiatives, where the legal system now grapples with how to address historical disadvantages created by the very racial categories it once enforced. They surface in arguments about immigration and border policy, where fears about cultural change are sometimes still framed in terms of preserving a demographic majority. How would our legal systems look if they had never been built upon this artificial taxonomy? Would we measure disadvantage by family wealth or neighborhood resources instead of checking a box on a form? Would our efforts toward justice focus on repairing specific historical harms rather than navigating the blurred lines of racial identity? The myth of race demonstrates with brutal clarity how a story invented to create power can solidify into a legal reality that seems impossible to escape. This profound exploration of how we legally constructed racial difference prepares us to see the parallel myths that have defined another fundamental aspect of identity, the roles and rights of men and women. That legal fiction of biological race found its parallel in a mythology that divided not by blood, but by space itself. 19th century society carved the world into two distinct realms, the public sphere of industry and politics for men, and the private sphere of home and hearth for women. This was the separate spheres doctrine, a cultural story so potent it felt like a law of nature. It was not simply a social expectation, it was a legal blueprint that defined a woman's very existence. The doctrine of coverture was its ultimate expression, a legal principle where a wife had no independent identity. Upon marriage, her legal rights were absorbed into her husband's. She could not own property, sign a contract, or keep her own earnings. The law saw the husband and wife as one person, and that person was the man. This mythology then justified a web of employment regulations that systematically barred women from many professions, framing them as too delicate or morally pure for the rough and tumble public world. These laws were not just barriers, they were active sculptors of destiny, ensuring women's economic dependence for generations. Even the fight for suffrage was a direct battle against this myth, as opponents argued that women's gentle nature would be corrupted by the dirty arena of politics. The legacy of this division is not merely a historical curiosity. It echoes in our modern debates over work-life balance, where the expectation that women bear the primary responsibility for child care and domestic duties is a direct descendant of the separate spheres ideal. It resonates in legal battles over parental leave policies, which often still presume a male breadwinner and a female caretaker. Look at the gender pay gap or the underrepresentation of women in certain leadership roles. How much of this stems from ancient, unspoken assumptions about whose natural domain is the office and whose is the home? The separate spheres doctrine demonstrates with stunning clarity how a cultural story can harden into legal concrete, creating structures of inequality that take more than a century to dismantle. This rigid division of life into gendered territories makes the next logical step clear, as we turn to the foundational myths that legally define the most fundamental territory of all, private property itself. That powerful story of separate spheres divided our social world, but another 20th century myth claimed to describe an inescapable tragedy in our relationship with the natural one. A biologist named Garrett Hardin presented a simple, devastating parable. Imagine a pasture open to all, a shared resource where every herder can graze their cattle. Hardin argued that each herder, acting in their own rational self-interest, would be driven to add more and more animals to their herd. The personal benefit of an extra cow would go entirely to the individual, while the cost of overgrazing would be shared by the entire community. The result, he concluded, was inevitable. The pursuit of individual gain would lead directly to the collective ruin of the commons, leaving the pasture barren for everyone. This story, the tragedy of the commons, became one of the most influential metaphors of the modern era, a seemingly self-evident truth about human selfishness. This mythology did not remain a thought experiment. It was quickly adopted as the intellectual foundation for a vast body of environmental law and policy. For decades, it justified two primary solutions: privatization or heavy-handed government control. In the American West, laws governing public lands for grazing were shaped by this logic, creating a system of permits and fees designed to prevent the very tragedy Hardin described. Internationally, it fueled the push for privatizing fishing rights through individual transferable quotas, converting a shared ocean resource into a tradable commodity owned by private entities. The entire framework of top-down, state-regulated environmental protection, from pollution permits to hunting licenses, was built upon the assumption that people cannot be trusted to manage a common resource without strict external control. But what if the tragedy was not in our nature, but in the story we chose to tell? The political scientist Elinor Ostrom won a Nobel Prize for documenting what Hardin's myth had ignored. She traveled the world and found countless real-world commons that had thrived for centuries, from community-managed irrigation systems in the Swiss Alps to sustainable fishing grounds in Turkey. These communities were not trapped in a tragedy. They had developed their own sophisticated rules, monitoring systems, and social norms to manage their shared resources effectively and sustainably. The real tragedy was that this powerful mythology of inevitable failure had blinded policymakers to these successful, community-based models for generations. It makes you wonder how many sustainable traditions were dismantled and replaced with inefficient bureaucracies or exploitative private ownership because of a compelling but flawed story. Can you hear the echo of this myth in our modern debates over climate change, where the atmosphere is the ultimate global commons and international cooperation often stalls under the weight of national self-interest? The true legacy of the tragedy of the commons is not a law of human behavior, but a cautionary tale about the power of a single story to shape our world. It forces us to ask what other solutions for a sustainable future remain hidden in plain sight, obscured by the myths we have mistaken for reality. This focus on how we manage shared natural resources leads our inquiry directly into the human-made landscapes where most of us now live, to the powerful myths that have shaped our cities. The rolling fields and quiet villages of the countryside have long been mythologized as the true soul of a nation. This rural ideal, a pastoral dream stretching back to the Roman poet Virgil, paints agricultural life as inherently more honest, healthy, and morally superior to the crowded, corrupting city. This is not merely a sentimental preference for open spaces. It is a cultural force that has directly written our laws for centuries, elevating one way of living above all others. This mythology fueled the Homestead Act, a massive legal project that gave away millions of acres to those who would work the land, deliberately encouraging a specific, idealized lifestyle seen as the bedrock of national character. In our own time, this same story shapes the billions in agricultural subsidies distributed every year, which often favor small family farms in the public imagination, even as large agribusinesses dominate production. Zoning laws in countless towns and counties are drawn to preserve a rural character, legally restricting dense development to protect a pastoral aesthetic. This deeply ingrained myth even influences our ideas about food itself, where regulations for organic certification carry a powerful cultural weight, framing certain farming methods as purer and more natural, a direct echo of the pastoral ideal. The consequences are woven into our daily lives. Transportation funding can favor highway systems that connect rural areas over investments in dense urban public transit. Debates about sustainable development often pit the preservation of farmland against the need for affordable urban housing, as if one is inherently more valuable than the other. How might our policies look if we saw cities and countryside as interconnected parts of a single system, rather than a moral battleground between virtue and vice? This rural mythology reveals how our nostalgia for a simpler past can legally prioritize certain landscapes and livelihoods, creating a powerful, unspoken hierarchy of place. This final look at how we idealize a way of life prepares us for the last and perhaps most pervasive myth of all, the story we tell about the very purpose of our collective existence. That pastoral dream of virtuous country life is one version of a perfect society, but America built its identity on a different fantasy entirely. The American dream is the promise that in this land, hard work is the only currency you need to purchase a better life, a secure home, and a future brighter than your past. It is a story of relentless upward mobility, a national faith that individual effort will inevitably be rewarded with prosperity. This mythology did not just inspire generations of immigrants and pioneers, it became the legal DNA of the nation, encoded into statutes that aim to make the dream a tangible reality for millions. The Homestead Act was an early embodiment of this belief, transforming the myth of available land into a legal deed for any citizen willing to cultivate it. In the 20th century, this same spirit fueled the creation of the Federal Housing Administration and the GI Bill, government programs that legally engineered a pathway to home ownership for a burgeoning middle class. The mortgage interest tax deduction became a permanent feature of the tax code, a financial incentive rewarding the pursuit of the iconic single-family home. For decades, these legal frameworks operated on the optimistic assumption that the economic playing field was level, that the dream was equally within reach for all who were willing to work for it. Yet this powerful narrative often obscured the structural barriers built into the very system that promised opportunity. Redlining policies legally denied mortgages to black families in certain neighborhoods, while restrictive covenants written into property deeds prevented people of color from buying homes in white communities. The dream was legally guaranteed for some and systematically deferred for others. Today, the echoes of this mythology are deafening in our political debates. Arguments against expanding social welfare programs often hinge on the idea that they undermine the self-reliance and personal responsibility at the heart of the American dream. The escalating crisis of housing affordability and overwhelming student debt stand in stark contrast to the story of assured upward mobility. How does a national story persist when the material reality for so many fails to match its promise? The American dream endures because it is a story about hope, a cultural script that equates success with moral virtue. But its legacy is a legal landscape filled with both extraordinary opportunity and profound inequality, a testament to the power of an aspirational narrative to build a nation while sometimes blinding it to its own flaws. These 30 myths reveal a startling historical pattern. They were never just stories, but sophisticated tools for building the very architecture of society. When we step back, we see a recurring blueprint. In every era, from divine right to the social contract, cultures have used powerful narratives to explain the unexplainable, to justify who holds power and who does not, and to forge a shared identity from a collection of individuals. The birth of these myths is not random. They almost always emerge from the crucible of social upheaval during times of war, technological revolution, or massive migration. When the old order crumbles, a compelling new story provides a map for the unfamiliar territory ahead, offering stability by making new, often unequal, social arrangements feel natural, inevitable, and even sacred. Legal historians have pinpointed the key ingredients that allow a myth to harden into law. It must possess a strong moral justification, framing a new power structure as righteous or for the common good. It often invokes a historical precedent, whether entirely invented or carefully edited from the past, to lend it the weight of tradition. And crucially, it must offer practical utility to those in positions of influence, reinforcing their authority or economic advantage. The journey from folklore to legal code follows a remarkably consistent path. It begins subtly in the pages of a philosophical treatise, a poet's verse, or a religious sermon. The idea then escapes into the wild, picked up and repeated by political leaders and pamphleteers until it becomes a common assumption, a truth everyone seems to just know. Finally, it arrives in the courtroom and the legislature, where it is written into precedent and statute, its mythical origins now buried under the dry, authoritative language of the law. This predictable life cycle is our most powerful tool for understanding the present. By recognizing these patterns, we can learn to spot the emerging myths of our own time, the stories we are telling ourselves right now about technology, identity, and justice that are quietly, inevitably, on their path to becoming the laws of tomorrow. Our journey through these historical myths leaves us with an urgent question for our own time. What stories are we telling ourselves right now that are quietly hardening into the laws of tomorrow? The most potent myths are never identified as such while they hold power. They are simply accepted as reality. Today we are living through the creation of new foundational narratives, particularly in our digital lives. Consider the emerging myth of digital privacy as a personal commodity to be traded for convenience. This story, that our data is a fair price for free services, has already shaped a generation of legislation, from complex terms of service agreements to international data transfer pacts. Another powerful narrative is the myth of technological inevitability. The idea that artificial intelligence and automation will disrupt society in preordained ways that we can only adapt to, not steer. This story discourages proactive regulation and frames profound ethical choices as mere technical challenges. These are not neutral observations, they are cultural scripts in the making, on the same trajectory that once turned the divine right of kings into absolute law. This reality demands a new kind of literacy for every citizen. We must cultivate what can only be called mythological literacy, the skill to look at a proposed law or a political debate and ask not just what it does, but what story it tells about human nature, progress, and power. This is not about cynically dismissing all cultural narratives. Societies need shared stories to function. It is about developing the wisdom to understand where these narratives come from, whom they serve, and what kind of world they are building. The myth of the social contract enabled representative democracy, while the myth of Terra Nullius enabled centuries of dispossession. Both were powerful stories that became law. By learning to dissect the myths of the past, we gain the tools to consciously choose which emerging stories we will allow to define our future. The next chapter of our legal history is being written in the language of algorithms, climate response, and genetic code. Will we be passive characters in that story, or will we pick up the pen ourselves? Our journey through these 30 cultural myths reveals a profound truth. The stories we tell ourselves about who we are and how we should live together ultimately shape the laws we create and the traditions we uphold. From divine rights to digital frontiers, mythology continues to be the invisible architecture of our social world. The most powerful myths are not necessarily false. They are frameworks that help societies navigate immense complexity, though sometimes at a great cost to truth and justice. They provide a shared map for a confusing reality, offering a sense of order, purpose, and belonging. But as we have seen, that same map can also be used to justify conquest, enshrine inequality, and erase entire cultures from the legal record. As we move forward, may we approach our cultural narratives with both a deep appreciation for their power and a critical awareness of their limitations. The challenge is not to live without myths, for that is likely impossible. It is to choose them wisely and to revise them courageously when they no longer serve our collective well-being. What new myths might we need for the challenges ahead, for a world of planetary boundaries and artificial intelligences? I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this exploration resonated with you, please subscribe for more journeys into the hidden stories that shape our